Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. I think most of you know me, but I'm Anna McGinn, and I'm policy manager at the Environmental and Energy Study Institute and also a ASAP Policy Practice Group co-leader. And when I told the leadership team that I was going to be at COP, so I wouldn't be able to help with this meeting, everyone said, well, why don't we make the meeting about COP? So that was fun. So now I'm here from Dubai to talk to you about COP, and I love talking about COP, so I'm really very happy to do it. Um, so my plan is to kind of talk through some of the basics of COP, what I've seen over the first 2 days, and then what to expect in the rest of the 2 weeks here. But before we jump in, I wanted to sort of take a pulse on people's background with the international climate negotiations, just to sort of make sure I'm speaking to what might be of most interest. So we created two little quick poll questions I think Eliza's going to pull up. And while she's doing that, I'll just share a little. You should be able to multitask because they're pretty straightforward questions. So just a little background on my work on international climate negotiations. So I started following the COPs in 2011 at COP 17. And so this is the 8th COP that I've been to over those 10 plus years. And for the first many years, I was really focused on researching the negotiations specifically. And particularly, I was focused on climate adaptation finance issues. Now I attend in my current capacity at EESI focused on Congress. So we kind of follow the COP more broadly and report back to congressional staff on what we think is most useful and of interest to that group about what's happening here. Okay, since the poll is not working, that's no problem. Maybe people can just sort of like wave. So my first question was just how many people have been to a COP before? Okay. Josh has sort of been to a COP. Okay, cool. So it seems like some, but not a lot of people. And how many people have tracked COP, not been to one, but like pay pretty close attention to it from home? Okay, cool. So apologies to those couple of you that track this really closely, but it sounds like it'll make sense for me to start with some of the kind of introductory stuff and then jump into some of the more specific details of what we're seeing here. So really broadly, we are at COP 28 this year. That means we are at the 28th meeting of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was established in 1992, and basically it's a treaty that 198 parties, so parties are countries, but then can also be like the European Union is also a party. So 198 parties are all members of this treaty, and with this ultimate objective of preventing dangerous change of the climate. Those aren't the exact quoted terms, but essentially that's the ultimate objective of the UNFCCC. Since that time, you've probably heard of the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. So those are two kind of the massive substantive agreements that have followed up underneath the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is also the meeting of the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, and the meeting serving as the meeting to the Paris Agreement. So there's kind of multiple different channels of negotiations that happen in the really formal negotiation area. And that's kind of the core of why this exists, is to advance the work of country to country efforts under this treaty. There are also official observers to this process. There's 9 observer constituency groups recognized by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Some examples of those are the business and industry NGOs, the environmental NGOs, the research and independent NGOs, the local government group. So there's, and I could keep going, there's 9 of them. They get some official channels to feed into these negotiating processes. So at the opening plenary, they can make a statement. They can sit in on certain negotiations that might be otherwise closed to overall observers. So that's kind of the very core process and reason for existence of these COPs. However, the reality, especially now, is that they are surrounded by a million other things happening. So you've got the negotiations, but you may have heard people term sort of what happens outside the negotiations that countries are really involved in as like the metropolitan COP. So something like, you may have heard of the Global Methane Pledge. That is not something that specifically fell under the negotiations, but rather was something that countries brought sort of on the sidelines of the negotiations to announce in conjunction with it and to try to advance kind of in parallel. And then there's kind of a third element that, for lack of a better term, I kind of call the trade show element. It's people that are, it's the part of COP where people don't even know the negotiations are happening. They're there to connect globally with people that are also working at every level on these issues and share what they're doing, share lessons learned, that sort of thing. Probably never make their way over to the meeting rooms where the negotiations happen. So there's that I would consider not really a parallel track, but like an alternate universe, but also trying to achieve the same goal of climate action. So they're not at cross purposes or anything like that, but they don't interact all that much with each other. With the exception of earlier today, I was at a event that was sort of in that alternate universe place. And John Kerry was there with the prime minister from Greece talking about ocean issues. So they do like come over to give high level talks and that sort of thing. But it really is separate from the negotiations at their core. As we keep going here, I'm going to talk mostly about the negotiations themselves and kind of that metropolitan COP part. I'm going to talk less about the trade show piece, but I'm happy to answer questions about that if people want to talk about it more, because there's lots of really cool stuff that's happening there. And I should also say, trade shows sort of implies like private sector. It's civil society at large. So huge NGO presence that probably dominates, but definitely private sector and some national governments there as well. Yes, Josh, they're definitely, it depends on the COP, how much protest is allowed, but absolutely, there's been that world certainly does put pressure kind of on negotiations broadly, or at the idea of the negotiations broadly to do more, do better. Okay, so I thought it might be helpful to talk through sort of what happens over the 2 weeks of the negotiations. So we're in week 1 now. It's kind of weird. COP usually starts on a Monday, but it started on a Thursday. So every single person here is like very confused about what day it is. But I think today's Friday and it's only the second day of week 1. So when I say week 1, I mean really just the first 5 days of negotiations, and then week 2, about the second 5 days of negotiations. Okay, so during week 1, it's really all focused on technical negotiations. There is an agenda that gets adopted at the beginning of COP. You can look at it online if you so choose. There's actually a version that's like annotated to describe what each agenda item is and sort of the history of it, which if you're a COP nerd at all and want to learn about it, that's one really good way to kind of start to understand what's getting negotiated on. Not to get too technical about it, but there's 2 subsidiary bodies that fall under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. One is the subsidiary body on science and technological advice, SBSTA, and one is the subsidiary body on implementation, SBI. Those 2 entities basically like take all the agenda items of the negotiations under them respectively, depending on what falls where. And the negotiators get in rooms and talk about very specific details of the text to decide what are we going to do on this agenda item on the global goal and adaptation? What are we going to do on, like, what's our next step on the next finance goal? There are dozens of agenda items. Meetings happen, like usually one or two kind of significant meetings happen on each agenda item each day of the first week. And then there's also, they have some really fun lingo. So they have informal consultations, and they have informal consultations. Occasionally you'll get into informal consultations. And the more informal they get, the less likely observers are allowed in, and it's just the countries, so the parties talking to each other. But their goal is to hash out what they need to hash out in the negotiating text, to ideally have it be complete and ready for a decision to be taken on it at the end of COP. However, that happens on usually a subset of the agenda items, and then it doesn't happen on a subset of the agenda items. And the ones that it doesn't happen on, those get moved to the ministerial level negotiations during week 2. And that's when there's, you know, the ministers have a little bit more latitude to negotiate with their fellow parties about, you know, things that maybe the technical negotiators did not have the liberty to make agreements on, that were maybe outside of the original positions of the country or group of countries that you're talking about. So the ministers put their heads together. Usually 2 ministers are appointed to each agenda item, usually one from the global south, one from the north, and are paired up to try to get their colleagues to agree on text for each of the agenda items. And then ultimately, the idea is that the final decision text of the COP is all agreed upon, and COP concludes this decision. This is formally objects, then they can't close that agenda item. They could push it to the next meeting. There's various like ways around not closing the COP, but it is really interesting that they generally need consensus to move decisions forward. You've probably been hearing a lot about the COP presidency. So the presidency rotates between 5 UN regions. Generally speaking, the presidency also hosts the COP, though occasionally, for example, a couple years ago, Fiji held the presidency of the COP, but didn't have the capacity to hold COP in country, so it was held in Bonn, which is where the Secretariat of the UNFCCC is. But generally it rotates. So this is the Asia and Pacific year, pretty sure. And it's kind of interesting because I don't think most of us think of UAE as squarely in the Asia Pacific region, but that is why it is here this year, because basically what happens is that a country that's within that UN region has to offer to host it. No one offers to host it, it defaults to Bonn, where the Secretariat is. And if only one country offers to host it and everyone else agrees, then that's where it's hosted. So that's what happened. No other country offered to host it in this region. The UAE offered to host it, and that is why it's here. The presidency does have a lot of power in guiding this process. There's kind of like 2 ways in which the presidency has a lot of power. They don't set the agenda. The official negotiating agenda is set by the parties overall. But they do guide the process. They do sort of select which ministers they from other countries they get to co-lead the different agenda items during the minister week, the second week. And they have the ability to sort of decide what structures they're going to use to try to get countries to come to decisions on these different topic areas. They also can set their own sort of themes and priorities that aren't necessarily moved forward through the negotiations themselves, but through this sort of metropolitan COP world where we're expected to hear a declaration on health and climate at this COP, and we're supposed to hear a declaration on sustainable agriculture at this COP. And those are sort of presidency priorities where they're going out and getting other countries to get on board with the big declaration to agree to something. I'm not sure. I don't think either of those have actually been launched yet, so I don't know the details of them, but they have the ability to sort of like drive direction in terms of setting out these big sort of outside negotiation priorities. If you want to talk more about what's going on with this presidency, we can take questions afterwards. I can do my best to answer them. And then the last kind of major group within this process is the UNFCCC Secretariat. They're sort of the neutral coordinator of everything that happens at COP, and I should say throughout the entire year of COP, just throughout the entire year, because the negotiations really never stop. Like, we only hear about COP during the 2 days of this big meeting, but really negotiators are working with each other all year long in preparation to like have text ready to be negotiated on when we get to these 2 weeks. So the UNFCCC Secretariat really helps to like facilitate those processes throughout the entire year, and especially now. Okay, so I will keep moving as quickly as possible, but I can talk about COP forever, so someone needs to cut me off when we need to stop. But a couple observations from the first couple days here. COP in the last, I would say, 5-ish years has started to kick off with heads of state giving statements. 5 more minutes. Okay. So this year, that is the same. I think 170 heads of state are expected to give statements starting today. It'll go into tomorrow, and then there will be a second segment of the heads of state statements at the beginning of week 2. They give basically like 3-minute speeches about what their country's doing. A lot of them will make new funding pledges. And some of them will announce an updated nationally determined contribution. So their national climate commitment under the Paris Agreement. There's also the World Climate Action Summit happening right now, which is kind of slightly distinct, but running very parallel to these heads of state statements. That's where like Antonio Gutierrez spoke earlier today, and some other world leaders that aren't necessarily heads of state. Then for the first time ever this year, the presidency worked with Bloomberg Philanthropies to run the local climate action summit, which also kicked off today. It's the first time there's ever been sort of a presidency endorsed local or sub-national summit running in parallel with the heads of state statements. A lot of people are really excited about that. And it'll be really interesting to see if any of sort of the content of discussions from the local climate action summit gets taken up and included in any way into kind of any of the decisions that are taken at the end of this COP. It sort of is an interesting sort of not negotiations, but also not entirely separate from them. So it's sort of a messy gray area there, but an exciting new development at this COP for subnational action. And there's a lot of US subnational leaders here, mayors and state officials, which is always really exciting to see that presence. Okay, so yesterday, COP started Thursday. The COP starts with adopting the agenda. We talked about the agenda a lot. But for the first time ever, and I did confirm this just a couple hours ago with someone who's been tracking COP since COP 1, and she said she was pretty sure it was the first time ever. A final decision was also made as they opened the agenda, and you may have seen this in the news because it got a lot of coverage, but they adopted the language to operationalize the loss and damage fund, which was agreed upon that they would create something like a loss and damage fund at COP27, but no one really knew what that would look like. And this transitional committee did an enormous amount of work over the course of the last year to come to an agreement on kind of the general parameters of what that fund's going to look like before this COP began, to the point where they were actually able to open and close that agenda item at the opening plenary. It got a huge standing ovation, and people were extremely excited. And it's also exciting because it's so important, and it is going to allow more space for other also important things to have to be negotiated at this COP, that will also support the loss and damage fund getting the support it needs. But the loss and damage fund isn't going to take up all the attention of negotiators, so some of those other things wouldn't have necessarily happened at the level that they can now. So also exciting because they were able to initiate the operationalization of the fund. Countries could start pledging money to it, and they did. So just last night, my time, more than $400 million by I think 6 or 7 different countries and country groups like the EU pledged money. It's obviously not even close to enough money, but some thought that no one would put money into this fund. So it's a pretty it's a welcome development that so much was announced right away. And the UAE put money in, and that is, significant on the surface because they're the presidency, and it, signals leadership that they want to put money in the fund. But you're familiar with kind of the history here of developed versus developing country kind of roles under the UNFCCC. The UAE is historically in the developing country group, and the fact that they are putting money into this fund signals that other countries that are sort of in the UAE's economic bracket should also consider putting money in there. So for example, China might consider putting money into this fund. So it kind of sets a precedent that it doesn't have to just be the US and the EU and Australia putting money into the fund. Rachel's looking at me like it's the end, so I'm going to.
I mean, you don't need to end. You just need to end the plenary version of this conversation. We're gonna next hear from Joel Smith speaking specifically on the global stock take. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go into breakout rooms. So Anna will host one and Joel will host one. And so we are going to do the majority of our questions and answers in those breakout groups. And then we'll come back together for some final wrap-up questions and discussion. Okay, it's over to you, Joel.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. And wow, Anna, that was great. I mean, what it's like between jet lag and being 9:30 there, you're incredibly lucid. Looks like you also have a decent hotel room, so that helps. Now, I was just going to point out, since we focus on adaptation, there's 2 things to keep an eye on. So under the Paris Agreement that Anna mentioned was agreed to in 2015, the Paris Agreement is essentially, rather than a top-down required reductions that was tried to be imposed by Kyoto, but essentially didn't work. This is more voluntary. It's basically that everybody comes to the table, makes their own pledges, but there's a mechanism to try to ratchet things down so you don't have backsliding. That's called the global stock take, and that happens every 5 years. And this is the first year, 2023, at this COP. and they're covering three elements: pledges to reduce emissions, adaptation, and then finance. The adaptation one is of particular interest to us. There's also, at the same time, there's an attempt to develop a global goal on adaptation. To say what is it? We have the 2-degree target with a goal of 1.5 for mitigation. We don't have anything other than maintaining not undercutting sustainable development relating to adaptation. And I don't know, Rachel, if you don't mind, I know if it's okay, if I could deviate, I know Ira Feldman is on the call and is actually leaving for UAE, I think tomorrow. But Ira, is there anything to report on the status of negotiations on the global goal on adaptation? If you don't mind me putting in a spot for a minute or two.
I don't mind if nobody else minds. I just threw into the chat a link to the 4 policy papers that IPAM, the International Platform for Adaptation Metrics, just posted yesterday on their website. One of them is a recap of what's been happening with the global goal on adaptation. As brief as I can be, I'll just say that in the fall of last year, the Secretariat came out with a compilation and synthesis document that threw together all the background material that could possibly be relevant to the global goal on adaptation. A tremendous resource document if one could figure out what to do with it, but no one could figure out what to do with it. So we embarked on doing our own assessment of that. That is one of the 4 papers that you'll find posted. In brief, just to pick 3 open issues, there has been no decision as to whether there will even be any targets or metrics in the global goal on adaptation. That is an enormous gap that needs to be filled. At least the one thing that everyone agrees upon is that when the global goal on adaptation is resolved, it's going to have to reflect policy coherence with the SDGs and the Sendai framework. And everyone seems to be clear about that. And then finally, of course, the big one is finance, where some parties will walk away from the global goal on adaptation discussion if finance is excluded, and the other half will do the opposite. So that is the quick and dirty update on global goal on adaptation. It is my own view is it's highly unlikely that a satisfactory result will emerge before the end of COP28.
So thanks, Ira. That's interesting, and I'm glad you posted those references. And I'll add, with regard to the stock take, I think we'll see what comes out of this, but related to the global goal, there really is a question of sort of what do you measure, and without getting into diving into things like logic models, there really a question: are you measuring inputs like finance, as Ira mentioned, or development of national adaptation plans, that kind of thing, or to what extent are you measuring or adaptations being implemented, like early warning systems, or ultimately do you look at, and Ira mentioned like the Sustainable Development Goals and Sendai, ultimately look at what effect do these adaptations have? And that's ultimately is, in my view, the acid test. I mean, are we preventing loss of life? Are we preventing loss of property? We're protecting ecosystems. And that's a lot harder to do. And I think one thing that'll be interesting to keep an eye on is whether the global goals on adaptation, as well as the stock take, really focus on inputs like finance or adaptation plans, or do they ultimately sort of start turning to, well, what good is this doing, say, in terms of vulnerability to climate change or that kind of thing, incomes or whatever. So that's sort of my quick look on it, Rachel. Happy to turn it back to you guys. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joel and Ira, and to everyone who's been putting the resources that they've found helpful in the chat as well. So if you're not looking at the chat, check that out when you get a second. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go into breakout rooms so that we can ask more in-depth questions and have slightly smaller scale discussions. So one room will be with Anna talking about COP28 holistically, and one group will be with Joel talking about the global stock take. And perhaps Ira, if you want to go in with them, we can fold in global goal and adaptation as well if folks would like. So you should be able to choose your breakout room. You can feel free to go ahead and do that. If neither one of those breakout rooms speak to you, but you still want to have a smaller scale discussion, you can also stay in this room and we can help folks get started in here as well. So yes, feel free to choose breakout room and unmute and let us know if you need help.